Great. So, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. A very warm welcome to our deep dive webinar on identifying and assessing child labor risks and impacts. We are very happy from the Global Compact side to host this webinar in collaboration with Save the Children and the Swiss State Secretariat for Economical Affairs. Next slide, please. If we go to the next slide. Yes, I just wanted to very quickly highlight the housekeeping rules that we will apply throughout the webinar. So the webinar is recorded. The slides as well as the recording will be made available to all of you after the webinar. And please, during the Q&A, activate your video if you can, if you want to make an intervention. And during the webinar, please make sure you are muted until you, unless you really have a burning question. And for the questions, you can use the chat function. We will take the questions at the end of the presentations. So on the next slide, I just wanted to highlight that this deep dive webinar is part of a series of 4. So today is the first one. We will have 3 others in 2025. The dates will be communicated soon. So the webinars will happen at the beginning of 25. And they will be on engaging with stakeholders on the topic of child labor, then on grievance and remediation processes, and on understanding the impacts of companies on children's rights beyond child labor. On the next slide, please, we will see the topic and the agenda for today. So we will have a few words by Céline Brucker from SECO. We will then have Ines Kempfer from the Center for Child Rights and Business, together with Sate Zhao. She is Senior Vice President at Li Fung. Ines is the CEO of the Center for Child Rights and Business, and they will speak about supply chain risk assessments. Then we will have Deborah Schmiediger from Save the Children, who will speak about finding long-term solutions. Deborah is Program Manager, Child Rights and Business at Save the Children. And then we will finish again with Ines on the topic of responsible business practices. To end the webinar, we will have quite a long Q&A session if we make it on time. So please don't hesitate to write down your questions in the chat, and we will discuss them at the end. Now I would like to hand the floor over to Céline for some introductory words, and I wish you all a very good webinar.
Thank you, Alice. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this inaugural session of our deep dive webinar series on combating child labor. We are really pleased to collaborate with Save the Children, the Center for Child's Rights and Businesses, and the UN Global Compact Network Switzerland and Liechtenstein in those follow-up webinars. Over the course of 4 enlightening workshops, we will explore various critical aspects of addressing child labor. Today's focus will be on identifying and assessing the risk and impact of child labor. This is a fundamental step in the due diligence process, not only to comply with legal obligation, but also to make a genuine positive impact on human rights, children's rights, and the fight against child labor. This webinar is part of the Swiss National Action Plan on Business and Human Rights, in which the Federal Council reminds the companies that he expected every company based or operating in Switzerland to respect human rights in all their activity wherever they operate. Our goal is to equip you with the knowledge and the tools necessary to effectively recognize and addressing these risks in your operation and supply chain. This is crucial for fostering an environment where children are safeguarded and their rights protected. We are honored to have experts from our partner organization who will share insight and strategies that are both actionable and transformative. I'm looking forward for this discussion and thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much, Celine. And now I would like to hand over to Ines from the Center for Child Rights and Business. Ines, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much to SECO, to Global Compact for having us, and for everyone for joining and taking your time to spend a little time discussing this topic. Please do tell me if suddenly my connection is not that good, then I'll try to move position or something.
At the moment, we hear you very good.
Very good, because I couldn't hear so well before, so I was a bit worried if my connection is off. Okay, so we'd like to share a couple of thoughts today around supply chain risk assessments, and these thoughts are really based on quite a bit of experience. And Sandra, if you can show the next slide. As in the last couple of years, I think that's from the last 4 years, we've done over 65 child rights or child labor risk and impact assessment. And as you can see from this little world card, in really a range of supply chains across the world, in totally in 21 different countries that we did those. And so a lot of the points and learnings that we're sharing today really come out of these experiences that we had when we, as the Center for Child Rights, work together with companies to understand assessment. A very quick word on the center. We are a social enterprise that was set into life by Save the Children in Sweden, to work very closely with companies to understand the impact they have on children and children's rights in their supply chain, and then also work with companies to find very practical solutions on how we can have a positive impact. And this work has led us to this level of assessments, and we'll share a little bit about that. So first, I would like to share 4 kind of key findings on the next slide, that what some key points, I think, before we start, to take away on child rights risk assessments. First of all, why is it so important that in certain assessments we do take a specific perspective at children and at child labor? And one of this is that children really very often identify or are identified as the most vulnerable group, but also as the most honest one. So they're vulnerable because often they're children, so they're not organized. Often they're not listened to. They're not joining a union, but are often very strongly impacted by our supply chains. The interesting thing and the kind of the refreshing thing when doing child rights risk assessments and talking to children is also often that we see they're very, very honest, and we can actually find a lot of issues, sometimes not even only regarding children, by conversations or including children into our child rights risk assessment. Another important learning from these many risk assessments is that really the most effective way, particularly when we are starting from a risk-based approach, which is what is asked for by the OECD, by the CSDDD, that we're looking for that we, basing our attention to where we have risks. And this, in this sense, and we will talk more about that, it really makes sense to use a funnel approach and to come from a higher perspective and to dig deeper to really get deeper insights in supply chains. And that these supply chains then, or these assessments, should then focus on where companies' operations have a impact and are a multiplier of potential risk. A lot of the risks that we identify, and again we'll talk about that, are not only due to action of the company. Often, things are complex. There's poverty, there's political situations, etc. It's really complex, but we know that in certain situations, companies are multipliers. And lastly, I think it's also very, very important to know that when we say child rights risk assessments, it's not only directly checking is there child labor. Well, obviously that's important, but a lot of times it also includes looking at the working conditions of parent and parent workers, because those working conditions can have immense impact on the well-being of children that really also can affect to what degree their rights are protected or not. So these are a couple of key thoughts, and we'll talk more about those as we're going through this webinar today. On the next slide, I kind of we show the process, how it's done. It's not always done like that, because things are not always how one plans them. But when we start, particularly when we can start working with companies that is not in a crisis mode, so not a company suddenly had some sort of article somewhere that child labor occurred, but is actually, if one starts working from a preventative mechanism, then we recommend we start with a high-level risk mapping, that we understand where are your risks potentially, and I will talk about in a second on how to do that. And from there we go deeper. We look at on the ground where we have identified potential risks. We take a deeper look to see how does this look. This can be an audit in a kind of traditional sense, but obviously is even more effective if that's a thorough child rights risk and impact assessment, particularly if we want to take a closer look in lower tiers or in informal sectors. And that knowledge then can help us to improve our corporate practices, really how we as a company can do better business. And we'll talk about that a little bit at the end of this webinar. And then really leading also to programs or the direct kind of investments that can be monetary, but doesn't need to be investments into our supply chain. So this is just the ideal process on how risk assessments can trigger actual change on the ground. Now I will talk a little bit more about the funnel approach that we want to use. And on a very high level, and Sate nicely is here from Li and Feng to later give us a bit more or an example how they have done it. But we can build on public data, statistics, audit results. So that's all information that we already have. And when we use this information the right way, it can really allow us to give this high-level risk categorization, where we're looking at contextual risks, what we call supply chain risks, risks that we have seen, for example, through our auditing programs, or maybe other programs have seen and that we're part of, programs like Amphori, or we use resources coming to us through the Global Contact. All of that can really help us to get a good sense of where our risks are. And it's from there then that we do this deep dive into assessments, where we look at where do we actually have the risk, where do we have this really high level of relevance. And I've already on the next slide showed this a little bit closer, and I can talk to that a little bit more. Sandra, if you can move to, yes, thank you so much. So when we look at these, and Sate will make an example on how they used these tools, contextual and supply chain related risks. Just when we try to understand what are the contextual risks, it's important to obviously have some understanding on, particularly if we now focus on child labor, what is it that drives child labor? What are the factors that we know can increase child labor risks? And also, to what degree are we kind of linked to those in business? And if those of you who have been looking at kind of the CSDDD already, don't know to what degree Swiss companies will be affected, but they might at least indirectly be affected. But also those of you who have worked with the OECD guidelines, you might remember this classification of looking at impact that is either caused, partially caused by the company, or where the company is linked to. And it obviously makes always a lot of sense for companies to look at those areas where there's some sort of linkage, not because other areas like government structures, etc., do not have an impact on child labor, but just because that's not necessarily where companies have their responsibilities and their due diligence. They have that responsibility in particular to those areas where they're somehow linked to. So things like migrant workers, like how many migrant workers are in our supply chain, where they're working, etc. That is an area which isn't caused by the company, but there's a clear linkage, as these people are obviously working in the supply chain, and that can often be a factor and kind of increase or decrease risk. We know that things like access to schooling can increase or decrease risk. But also there is a lot of factors within supply chain as production related information that can decrease or increase risk. What we mean with that, certain processes, for example, are more hazardous. Certain processes are requiring a lot of low-skilled workers. And these, particularly when that comes together, when it's low-skilled and hazardous, then we know that the risk for child labor, if that is happening on top of that in a context of poverty and maybe a limited access to schooling, then we know we might have a big risk of child labor, because young children can do this work. It's in that sense easy work from a technical perspective. But we also know even if they're in working age, 16, 17, the work is very hazardous and thus will qualify as child labor by ILO definition. So we're looking at those contextual and supply chain risks. We're looking at the what we call the identified risks. So that's risks we already know of because we have auditing programs, or we have access to auditing data, and we have some understanding on what the risks are. And to some degree, we then can also consider our business leverage. Now, business leverage is a bit tricky, particularly in terms of the new CSDDD text, because it clearly says, so a low business leverage or a low business volume should not, cannot be a reason why we don't look at risk. So if we identify certain processes, certain supply chain as very, very high risk, but our business volume is relatively small, we cannot just say, particularly, I'm not so sure in the Swiss law, it might be a bit easier, but in the European law, definitely, if in the from the directive that is going to become law, we cannot just say, oh, we don't have a lot of volume, therefore we don't look. When we identify high risks, the human rights due diligence guidance, and that's also based on OECD, wants us to go and take a closer look, no matter whether we have a huge business leverage, a huge business volume or not. But obviously, business volume can help us to say, where do we start? Do we start with the ones where we know we also have some leverage to actually to have an influence and to make changes? Then that can be justified, but it cannot be a justification for ignoring risks. And maybe Sate will talk about this a little bit more as well. And that can then help us to create what we call a target prioritization, which then can lead companies to go to the next steps. And I think with that, I will hand over to Sate to share a little bit how Li and Fong went about this process. Yeah, so over to you.
All right. Thank you, Ines. Are you able to hear me clearly?
Yes.
Ines? Okay.
Yes,
yeah,
we
so
hear
much.
you well.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah, thank you. First of all, thank you so much. My name is Satay Chow. I'm the head of vendor compliance at Li & Fong Limited. First of all, thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to speak with you today. And next, please, Sandra. Thank you. Yeah, so a bit about Li & Fong. So Li & Fong Trading Limited, the company is founded in 1906, is like 11 and 18 years old. And then we are headquartered in Hong Kong, and primarily our company is a global supply chain management company. So what we do is that we offer comprehensive end-to-end solutions, including product design, raw material procurement, productions, quality control. And in terms of product, we source and also deliver a very wide range of products, including apparel, footwear, accessories, household items to US and European brands, globally. And in terms of our suppliers and factories, we don't own factories, but however, we are partnering with over 4,300 factories, over 30 countries. A lot of these are in in China and also ISC and Greater ASEAN. And then if you look at the footprint, basically with 4,300 factories and also 30 countries, we cannot be everywhere at once. And therefore that we need a tool to help us to prioritize our spot check. So that is exactly what Ines just have talked about the funnel approach. Next, please, Sandra. All right. So regarding the risk matrix, so this is really like a high level overview in terms of the approach that we are taking. So the risk matrix is built up by combining I would say the various operational risks and also the contextual driver of the risk. And then with these two, we look into the different type of the, I would say, the risk, and then it will come up with a inherent risk. After that, we will also look into the previous audit result, and then with that, we call it managed risk. After that, we combine both of these inherent risk and managed risk, and it will give us like a certain risk level for the site. It can be high, it could be medium, it can be low. And after that, we further look into the business leverage, how big they are, what is the business leverage that we have, what impact can we make, and then to help us to further prioritize, our spot check. As Ines mentioned, like for the CSDDD, it's not like that, business is small and there is a risk we can ignore them. But based on this approach, it's really help us to prioritize, where we should start first. Next, please. And so if we look into the contextual risk, basically we have identified a couple, I would say, key risk indicator, including, for example, school enrollment, poverty rates, and also we look into the global slavery index and also the regulatory quality in the country. In this example here, it shows you that for Bangladesh, overall, it has a risk score about 3. And each of the risks we take I would say a 25% of the of each of the weighting. And then after we look into the contextual risk, we also look into the supply chain risk. Next, please, Sandra. For example, in terms of the supply chain risk, we look into, for example, we look into the level of automation. Is that product able to produce, largely by automation, or is that mostly by, I would say, quite still a lot of manual work? And also if that work require very high skilled worker or low skilled labor, and also to what degree the process hazardous. And all these actually will give us another risk variable. And then after that, we also look into the number of workers in that facility. For example, if that require a large number of, I would say, manual work, but however, the production, I would say, the facility, the number of workers is actually very small. Actually, it's already tell us that the risk level in that facility can be at a risk. So with that, we have, again, by combining this, we have a risk score. Next one, please, Sandra. And, so we look into the contextual risk, we look into the supply chain risk, and then next to that, we also look into our managed risk. When we talk about managed risk, is that we look into the previous audit results. And for example, if a factory, they didn't have a audit in the past 2 years, in fact, that we consider that the risk is high because for 2 years, there is no activities, meaning like audit or spot check at the factory. We actually don't know what is going on. Likewise, for example, on the other hand, if a factory that is, having an audit that is A and B, we consider that risk level based on the audit is relatively, I would say, low. So, and this part we call manage the risk. Next one, please, Sandra. So after that, we look into the inherent risk, which is a combination of the contextual risk and the supply chain risk, plus also the managed risk. And then based on that, we combine all this information and to define a risk level. For example, if the inherent risk here is medium, while the managed risk is actually high, 4, then if you look at this matrix, the risk level of this particular site is considered as high. Sandra, would you please go next? And then after that, we also look into the priority. Of course, the very high risk site has the highest priority, right? But however, because of the number of facilities that have, we still need to further prioritize it. In order to further prioritize it, we actually also look into the business leverage, how important it is. And then we will start with those that where we have a bigger business leverage, where we can make a bigger impact and also influence on the supply as well. And with that, we were able to identify I would say a certain number of the suppliers where we think the risks are higher, and then we can focus on our on-site assessment on these suppliers. And having said that, we actually also make plan for the second batch and also the third batch, so that we are making sure that we also cover all the factory that we identify that have risks in our supply chain. I think next. Yeah, I think that's just a sharing of how we actually use the model, the funnel model, help us to actually identify, the different level of risk in our supply chain, which in turn help us to look into how we prioritize where we should start first. Thank you. Over to you, Ines.
Thank you so much, Sate, for this example, and I hope you can stick around so that we have some opportunities to ask some question, because I do think it's very impressive to see how you guys went about that, and obviously we also continuing refining, as real results are coming in, to continue working together and refining those risks.
Yes.
And I just going to talk a little bit, a few more minutes around kind of a case study too in the agriculture setting. Now, this was the case or this next slide, and we can go to the slide already, is actually, so we are further down in the funnel now and looked at one country where one partner has identified the coffee supply chain as to have certain risks and wanted to take a closer look at the coffee supply chain. So it is still not specifically just for one supplier, but it's for one country, one commodity that we looked at. So we're further down in the funnel a little bit. But I think the reason I brought this example with us, because we actually took a similar approach in the sense that we also didn't just go about and just, check, is there child labor? Yes, no, but really looking at it from a risk perspective and really trying to understand what factors are increasing the risk during that assessment, so that we don't only have this one kind of snapshot in time and say, oh, we haven't found any children, or we have found 10 children, but that we really start to, or can understand what are the factors that are potentially an increasing risk. And the result was really something that at least our client didn't know before. We didn't know it before, so we were quite like intrigued by this result. So basically what we did, we mapped the whole kind of processing of the different of the different coffee production. And what we saw from the client, they had basically two kind of coffee that they were sourcing. One is Arabica, one is Robusta, which is the biggest coffee groups in Vietnam. And we looked at the different processes within the production of Arabica coffee and the different processes within Robusta coffee. And when we on top of looking at the working conditions, we talked to the farmers and we talked to the communities. And we did identify, particularly when talking to the farmers, that child labor was unfortunately a continued concern in coffee production in Vietnam. We heard quite a few, like we often, to start with, heard the sentence, oh, the children only work sometimes on the weekends and maybe during the harvest. But then when we talked to the teachers, we identified that the harvest was up to 6 months long, not just for coffee, but these farmers generally are all multiple crop farmers. So they also have the harvest of the apricots and the harvest of the peppercorn. And so it turned out that actually children miss up to 6 months of schooling during the harvest time, which then obviously from our perspective is a real child rights violation, because that is the denied access to education, and obviously also by any ILO standards will then qualify as hazardous work. We also saw that young workers aged 15 to 17 worked in very hazardous conditions, not seldom in bonded labor conditions, where they were given loans or and then they had to work to pay back these loans, and so could not effectively leave their work and were as such effective in bonded labor conditions. what was really interesting, because we looked at this also from kind of the linkages to the production, that we saw a very clear connection between the crop and the region. And I think throughout we saw that the risk for Arabica coffee, because of the different way of producing it, was much lower than the one for Robusta. And you can see here, it's really quite striking. So only 33% of parents, I mean, only, still a significant amount, but still, 33% of parents said that their children who were under 18 contributed to the family income. In the Robusta family coffee farms, this was 67%. So a really strong difference between that. And the reason I bring this is just to show how these kind of assessments really now can guide the company. For one, in Vietnam, where they need to look closer, where their risk is increased. But it actually even guides the companies beyond Vietnam, because they saw that the production processes that are different between the different coffee crops might be something that they have to look at in other countries as well. And because the Arabica coffee was so much more, it's smaller productions, it's smaller family farms, like a few hired workers, etc. Whereas Robusta coffee is much more labor intense in terms of the migrant workforce that is being hired. And as such, the risk it was increased there. So I think really interesting kind of findings that allow the company now to, based on those findings, take the right approach to see where do we start, how do we look into this. And clearly in this case, I've identified the migrant workers. It's mostly domestic migrant workers, so it's Vietnamese migrants that move between provinces, but that this creates an increased risk, and increased also, even in terms of child labor, also increased risk in terms of forced labor. So yeah, so with this example, I think I hand over to Save the Children, to Deborah, to share a little bit on where we're going from these kind of results.
Thank you so much, Ines. I just wanted to thank you and Sate for those two wonderful presentations. This was so clear and interesting. Thank you so much. And I'm sure we will have a lot of questions at the end of the webinar. Now, as you already mentioned, we can give the floor to Deborah on finding long-term solutions. Deborah, it's yours.
Thank you very much, Alice. And also big thanks from Save the Children Switzerland to the Global Compact and to SECO to organize this webinar. I'm very pleased to now build on my two previous colleagues to zoom out a bit, actually, and to also let us dive a bit more into the longer term solutions to tackling child labor and what companies can do to actually tackle the root causes of child labor. As you know from these risk assessments, some of the root causes have already been mentioned, but today I want to go a bit deeper into what these root causes are and how companies can respond to those. Just a quick word on Save the Children. We are the world's leading independent child rights organizations. We are currently active in about 120 countries, where we aim to create conditions for children to learn, to be protected, to survive and to thrive. And we complement the work of the Child Rights and Business, of the Center for Child Rights and Business, in the sense that we are focusing more on the enabling conditions in the production countries. Please go to the next slide, Sandra. So on this slide, as you can see, it's quite well illustrated that child labor is often invisible. We can do the risk assessments, which give us a good idea and a good sense of where the risks are. But oftentimes those risk assessments, they only discover the child labor challenges at the surface. But often child labor really appears in the lower tiers of the supply chain. So in the subcontracted factories, in the smallholder farms, in the workshops, and in the artisanal miners. When talking about child labor, it's therefore really important to understand those challenges from the perspective of the children, from the families, and also from the communities. Evidence has shown that child labor is caused by a multitude of factors. In producing countries, laws are often weak and the enforcement capacity remains very limited. Government institutions are often understaffed and operate also under severe budgetary restrictions. And this also applies to government services that relate to child protection, to education or health. So, for example, in the informal sector in the Democratic Republic of Congo, children are working in artisanal and small-scale mines and are not legally protected by the state from dangerous conditions. The absence of affordable quality education also forces children into the workforce. For example, in conflict-affected regions in the Middle East, such as Syria and Yemen, destroyed school infrastructure and scarce educational opportunities also drive children into child labor. Also, socioeconomic pressures, poverty render children vulnerable to child labor. When families cannot afford to meet their basic needs like food, water, education, or health, they have no choice but to send their children to work to supplement the household income. So, for example, in Guatemala, particularly in indigenous communities, rural families depend on children to help with agricultural labor such as harvesting coffee or sugarcane. Then another important driver of child labor also relates to cultural norms. As you know, in some areas of this world, child labor is still normalized as part of family and societal expectations. So, for example, in West Africa, cultural norms in cocoa growing regions perpetuate child labor on child labor plantations. You can go to the next slide, Sandra. So, why is it important to understand the drivers of child labor? As the previous slide has shown, the root causes of child labor are really complex. So, if a company aims to tackle child labor in the long run, it is not sufficient to put in place only, I'm saying only in parentheses, a robust risk assessment or a child labor policy. But companies are also advised to look at the enabling conditions in the producing countries and in the communities where these products are produced or grown. By focusing on the prevention in the communities, companies can actually build the foundation for sustainable business in the future. What does this mean? It means that companies can use their power by confronting the root causes of issues rather than the symptoms. So this can be done, for example, by transforming structures, by customs, by transforming mindsets, power dynamics in the supply chain, policies, through the active collaboration of a diversity of people and organizations. So the approach that you can see here on this slide is a holistic approach that is rooted in the belief that if companies take practical steps to transform their business practices and at the same time also support the enabling conditions in the producing countries, like strengthening the national systems or the national institutions, then in the long run, this would create the conditions for child labor to be reduced over time and would require less monitoring by the companies over time. So this will reduce the company's own due diligence burden and enhance also the possibility of referrals between the corporate and the public systems. So if these partnerships between the private and the public sector are implemented in a holistic way, as it is shown here on this slide, then this really presents an opportunity to ensure that the national systems are strengthened over time, which, as I said, relieves the burden on companies' due diligence. Based on our experience, we usually advise companies and national governments to tackle the various challenges that the various root causes for child labor together and not in isolation, because success in one area is actually often dependent on the success in other areas, and I will explain later why. So the following slides will give you a snapshot of how a potential intervention in a community, in a producing country could look like, what could be preventative measures on child labor in those communities. But please note that these measures are not exhaustive and they can be further expanded depending on the local needs and contexts. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, education is one big challenge in the area of child labor. It's a key driver to keep children away from child labor. So interventions in schools could therefore aim for creating a quality and safe learning environment for children. This can be best achieved by bringing the whole community together, including the community leadership, the teachers, the children, the students, and the community leaders. And measures to tackle or to improve the education environment in a community could, for example, include the development and strengthening of policies and systems for a safe school environment and school safety. It could include also the construction of adequate school facilities, the enhancement of knowledge among teachers and children around safety and protection at school, and or the setting up of bridging classes or catch-up classes to enable out-of-school children to catch up on the learnings that they missed while working in the field, for example. On this photo, you can see a 12-year-old girl. Her name is Sitali. She lives with her parents and 4 siblings in a tiny village in Zambia. For many years, Sitali's community did actually not have a school. So this meant for her that she had to take a canoe to the main road and then drive a long distance to the nearby government school. And she missed out on education, unfortunately. In such a situation, when actually economic hardship would hit her parents, Sitali could be exposed to the risk of child labor. So building a school and equip the school adequately could be an important preventative measure. Please go to the next slide, Sandra. Another important area to prevent child labor is child protection, which means building the necessary structures for an early identification of child labor cases, and also building the awareness in the communities and in the families of what constitutes child labor. This is often the key success of such mechanism. Once then a child labor case has been identified either through the formal or informal mechanisms, we need to give the child adequate support in terms of his or her education, in terms of her health, in terms of her mental well-being, etc., which is usually part of the formal government structures. On this photo, you can see the hand of a 12-year-old boy, Munstosh, from Lualaba province, from southwest of the Democratic Republic of Congo. Munstosh has worked in a cobalt mine to support his family and afford food. 6 years of digging and collecting cobalt have taken a big toll on his physical health and costed him also his education. In the community where he lives, if the community would be aware actually on what constitutes child labor and would have had a mechanism in place to refer him to a social center where he would have been supported in relation to his health, education, or his mental well-being, then actually the chances would have been high that Munstosh would not have had to work for such a long time in the mine and would not have bared these serious consequences. Next slide, please. I mentioned also poverty and livelihood. There is actually a substantial body of evidence that demonstrates a strong link between household poverty and child labor. Actually, 2/3 of child labor is unpaid family work. Family income, particularly in agriculture, livestock, or fishing, can be really dependent on price fluctuations, on climate change and seasonality. Therefore, we need protective measures in place to for families to have a safety net in such cases. On this slide, you can see Rodrigo and his family. In November 2020, due to local storms, he and his family lost their harvest and their home was also partially destroyed. So in order to prevent his children from the risk of child labor, vulnerable farmers like him could be supported, for example, by improving business practices to make their farming more profitable and to have some savings, working with members of these households to diversify livelihoods, for example, through non-farm employment or entrepreneurship options. They could also be supported by youth employment, by vocational life skills or entrepreneurial training to the youth of their family. And also access to finance is another essential service for creating resilience and prosperity of vulnerable families. So for example, giving access to savings and loans could help the farmers to save for the future, to start a new business in case of an emergency. And this could be achieved, for example, through the creation of or strengthening of village savings and loan associations. Next slide, please. So as you can imagine, health is also a big issue in relation to child labor. Children who work in agriculture, mining, or also in factories, they are often exposed to health risks. They can suffer from exhaustion, injuries, and long-term damage. Hunger and malnutrition not only affect children's physical and cognitive development, but they can also impact their school performance or actually lead to not attending school at all. So sadly, children that are involved in child labor, they are more likely to experience worse health outcomes also later in life, which really creates a vicious circle of poverty. So to address these health challenges, the following measures could be taken. We could, for example, provide free or subsidized healthcare services, including treatment for injuries, chronic illnesses, or also malnutrition. We could also deploy mobile clinics to remote areas where child labor is prevalent. Children suffering from trauma could also have access to psychosocial services. To tackle malnutrition, one measure could also be to set up school canteens and provide free meals in schools. So these are all measures that one could take in order to prevent child labor and also to reduce the incidences of child labor in the long run. As I mentioned before, we always advise to implement those different areas together in a joint holistic strategy. Because, for example, poverty reduction and access to quality education, they must work in tandem, as financial stability enables families to prioritize education, while education ensures long-term economic empowerment. Also, working on changing the social norms complements, for example, the legal enforcement by aligning societal attitudes with regulatory frameworks, making laws more effective and widely accepted. Next slide, please. In all of these interventions that I have mentioned, one principle is very important to us, and we believe is also very important to companies. It's about stakeholder participation. It is really crucial to involve the children, the communities, and the families in the way they set up their priorities in the development of solutions and also in the decision making. If we take into account the children's voices in decisions that affect them, then they can advocate for their rights and raise awareness about the harmful effects of child labor. Empowered children are also more aware and more informed, and therefore are better protected against violence and exploitation. The empowerment of children also allows them to challenge dangerous situations in which they consider themselves, and they know where they can find appropriate support. And listening to children will also help expose incidents of violence, exploitation, and abuse. Equally important is the involvement of communities, because they best know their challenges and they should be empowered to develop their own plans and solutions rather than being externally driven. And finally, I think for business, listening to children might also be quite an effective an effective measure to manage the risks. So stakeholder input would provide companies with diverse viewpoints, which helps identify risks and opportunities that might otherwise go unnoticed. So business that engage stakeholders meaningfully are also more likely to gain community support and ensuring smooth operations of those interventions, which I have presented to you today. And just as a little information and announcement for all of you, in the next webinar, we will also dive much deeper into the issue of stakeholder engagement. So this was just a little teaser of the why, and then next time you will hear more about the how and the what. Thank you very much. With this, I hand back to my colleague Ines.
Thank you so much, Deborah. And yes, that was really very, very interesting. There's a lot to do. There's a lot that can be done. And now we're going to hear from Ines also where the responsibility of the companies and what the business practices are making for a difference in the positive or in the negative way. So Ines, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. And you can go right to the next slide, Sandra. And obviously coming back from that very helpful input from Deborah, and I think it's important to say, right, everything that Deborah now just described can be really, really meaningful impact in companies. I think when we look at it from a human rights due diligence perspective, there is a certain pathway for companies to say, where do we start and where do we need to look at? And obviously, their own business practices, the own business, how companies do the business, their core business is a really, really important point. And what we do hope that the new directives and the new laws, also the Swiss law, really help companies to push for is that we do start with their own business practices, knowing that these have such an important impact. I brought this, and I'm actually not sure, probably, anyways, if people have heard us, they might have seen this slide before, but this slide is kind of our theory of change, where we really show what drives child labor. That's in this red box on the right side. This is a simplification of our theory of change. But what drives child labor, on one is these contextual multipliers that also Deborah just was talking about, the lack of access, education, poverty, etc. But then we know, and as I also already indicated about before, is that the business can play a role as multipliers, unfortunately. So if we don't do business well, we're making things worse. If we pay insufficient wages because, or that the income of farmers is not high enough, that is linked to pricing, and I know it's not so simple, but there is a linkage there, etc., then we are making things worse. Then we are not helping to alleviate poverty, but we are enhancing poverty, increasing poverty. If our supply chains bring businesses to certain countries, but not in a way that benefits the local community, not in a way that benefits, for example, young workers or youth, because we're excluding them. We say, oh, we don't hire anyone, we don't give education, we don't give vocational training to anyone under 18. So we include that whole group from our formal businesses, we're pushing them into informal sectors. And obviously, if we don't take a close look, if we don't generate visibility and kind of ignore what's going on, all of these elements then will lead to actually multiplying the issues. And the positive, on the plus side, that also means that if we are changing some of those multipliers, we can actually have a positive impact. So if we're striving for example, fairer purchasing practices, we can actually create an impact. And obviously, if we do things like creating family-friendly workplaces where parents can really find a way to make a living, look after their children and work, etc., then we are creating a change. And I would like to show that on the next slide. Not going to go through every element. And actually, before I'm getting to the example, a quick reminder, but I did mention that in the first session already. But these are the OECD and similar the CS-DDD kind of linkages, whether a violation has caused or would be caused by the company directly, whether one has contributed to a certain violation, or whether one is linked to. So we can't really say, like if the workforce in my supply chains are migrant workers, I probably haven't contributed to their migration, but I'm still linked to them because these are workers within my supply chain. But in certain cases, if my low pricing makes a factory reduce the wages, or makes a factory cutting corners by not using their own employees, but using agents who hire employees on a short-term basis and then don't have to pay social security. If that's linked back to my purchasing practice, then obviously I have contributed to those elements. And in some cases, even it could come to a situation where we have caused certain violations. And it's obviously very important that companies do look at those linkages and understand those linkages before we go on and make it. You say, okay, we want to make a nice project somewhere. We need to understand what is our own impact. And I think this shows very well in the next slide. And that, I think, is going to conclude kind of my contribution this evening. But this slide, this is from a study in cotton production. It is from somebody who sources cotton from that area. So they're relatively closely linked, so they're not far away. They're relatively closely linked. And we looked at the situation of the cotton farmers in this area. And what you see here, and then we looked at where is this link to business, and what are the factors that lead to child labor. And so we saw a lot of factors that led to child labor, everything that started here with SH, that's schooling. So that's the to the degree that they were getting access to schooling, to the degree to which they were enrolled in the schooling. Sorry, now I just lost my slides. Had a big impact on child labor. You could see that is very high. The awareness on child labor issues seem to have, that's AWA, seem to have less of an impact. What we saw, what was really, really interesting, is that there were certain elements where the company had a direct impact. So, for example, the financial situation of farmers and the debt bondages that the farmers often were in, those were directly related to practices related to cotton farming, where the farmers at the beginning of the season receive loans to buy the materials that they need, from seedlings to work materials, etc. And that creates a situation of debt. And we could see that if that debt wasn't well handled, it created a situation of bonded labor for those farmers, which then needed them to work extensively, include their families, include their children, to a point where it came to child labor. And that was a direct practice that had an impact or like that was linked to the business. We could also see that school attendance, so that's the SCHA, was actually dropping significantly during harvesting season. So there we again had a certain linkage. It wasn't quite as strong as with the debt, because the payments, the loans came directly from the company, but still there was this linkage between harvests and school attendance. And so what we are saying, or why I think this picture shows so clearly why our business practices are so important, because we need to understand that with these actions, and also to a certain degree, like the pricings, etc., can be a multiplier and make things worse. So already in this region, school access is difficult. There's very limited social protection, etc. But in certain areas, through certain the ways the company behaved, they made this even worse. And on the plus side, that means that's where the company can work on. And what we actually saw is that the dependence on cotton, that's the DCO all the way in the bottom, did not have a negative impact. So the farmers who were depending on cotton weren't worse off than others. In some cases, they were actually better off. And so we could clearly show that if now in this context, the company also ensures that, for example, debt cannot get too high, that they're looking into what loans do farmers receive at the beginning, who covers the risk, for example, because the issue with the loans, if there's a good season, it's no issue. The farmers pay back, everything is fine. But given that we are living in a time of climate change where things are difficult, if they have a really bad cotton season, then they suddenly fall into even worse poverty than they were before. And so it's these issues that then companies, through their purchasing practices, can really work on. And that's true for this company who's relatively close to the production, but that's also true for companies further down the supply chain, right? If I understand my cotton is coming from this area, and my direct business partners who are sourcing from there and selling that to me are involved in these kind of practices, then we can work together with them and say, how can we change those practices? How can we have a better distribution of the risk, for example? So when we give loans at the beginning of a season, that not the whole risk is with the farmer in case, for example, the season is bad. And with that, I'm going to conclude with the last slide. I know that was very quick, and I think in the next 4 sessions, we'll go a little bit more into those points as well. But it's really important. So the reason that these business practices are so important is that because otherwise we are really at a risk that all those, the supply chain laws mean that we make glossy reports, that we kind of say, look, I've looked at my risk, I'm not involved there, I have some traceability here, we are probably not producing there, and that we then also disengage. And what we truly believe is that all of these new laws and all of these efforts should create more, and are written to create more transparency, to create a stronger accountability on the purchasing practices of companies, and thus then really lead to those improved lives through the interventions that we want to push. And that's just as a reminder. I think it's always good to remind why these laws and these directives, etc., were written, to help us kind of put us back on track to really focus on those elements that are most important. That's just for me, quick.
Thank you. Oh. Thank you so much, Ines. Thank you. That was really very important to say. I think we at the Global Compact, we also very much advocate for that, for responsible purchasing practices, responsible contracting practices as well, because if you put a clause in your contract that says that you will terminate the contract when you find child labor, this will not enhance transparency, but rather push everything on the hidden side. And I think, I mean, the fact that purchasing practices are so impactful is actually, well, of course, it's I think for many companies it's a new way of thinking, that they will have to review this. But on the other hand, it's also a good news, because this means that companies have the power to change things. And so by looking at this side of the coin, I think there's still a lot that can be done, and this is not done enough at the moment. So thank you so much. I think Ines, you are in the spotlight now. We only see you on the screen. Or is it only me that I don't know what's
It might be your setting in the
yes, it's
view.
my setting,
I still
exactly.
see everyone.
Okay,
So-
wonderful. That was my setting. I
Yes.
changed my setting and I now see everyone as well. Thank you so much. Now I would like to open the floor for questions. So I have seen that there is one comment in the chat regarding the focus on prevention, which is celebrated. So that's really good. Now I would like to open the floor to everyone, and please turn on your cameras, make a comment or a question. We still have time. No question? That can't be true. So Ines, maybe if I may ask a question myself, what would be your advice for a company that says, okay, maybe my purchasing practices at the moment are impacting my supply chain or the human rights, labor rights, child labor violations in my supply chain. Where should I start? What should I do? So where should the company look into?
I mean, obviously, it's important to understand how it is impacted, and also where change and kind of identify these areas where we can do change. So it always has two elements, right? One is to really understand how do we impact it. Is it? And I think not many companies do that. To be very honest, not many companies are looking very honestly at what is our price level, what does that mean down the end, what are our contracting terms, what that does mean down. In the end for the suppliers, and really looking at understanding those linkages. I think there needs to be some investment on that side. It's not just a click or one morning we said, okay, we're going to change that. And we know and we hear that a lot of times, company telling us we can't change the pricing. It's or it is to say there's a lot of pressure. So we are aware that these things are not super straightforward and not very, very easy. Obviously, we have seen examples of companies that have made changes and have, like, for example, Fairphone is a famous example where they really assessed how much would they have to pay for a piece of or for a phone that has been produced in this particular assembly factory for the factory to be really able to pay a living wage. And then they've made their pricing adjusting to that. I know Fairphone has a specific business model and that might not be so easy, but there are other elements to start with. For example, payment terms, which we know if payment terms are above 60 days, it can create a lot of issues for the producers. And and then obviously if the producer doesn't have the cash flow, then it's the workers who are not getting paid. And these are often workers at the limit of the living income. So not receiving a salary for a month or receiving it late by 3 or 4 weeks creates huge risks, right? That's the risks where then families can't pay the school fees anymore, when then the children will start working and drop out of school, etc. So these linkages are really, really important to understand. So I think it's both understanding how do we link to that and where can I start making changes? Because I know probably even if you're a super ambitious social compliance person within your company and you go there tomorrow to your boss and say, hey, we need to double the pricing, it might not, I mean, I'm not saying that you shouldn't tell him, but it might not happen immediately. So there needs to be some, what is feasible? Where can we start with? Where are the low-hanging fruits where we can do better? Other things like long-term commitments to companies, because we know that some of the risks are also coming from the up and down in sourcing, right? So if today I have no orders, tomorrow I suddenly have this huge order, and now I suddenly need 50 more workers, and then I'm gonna go and quickly call this guy that I heard he can come with 50 more workers, and I don't have time to do interviews and onboarding, etc. He just brings those workers along, and that's something we see a lot in Asia. We also see in China at the moment. They just bring these workers along, and then some of those workers might be children, or they come as a family, suddenly have children in your factory. So really looking at where are we with this purchasing practice, what can we do about? And I actually thank you for this question, because I can maybe mention there's an initiative, I think it's called Sustainable Trade Terms Initiative or something like that, and it's actually an initiative driven by producing or associations like the Chinese National Textile Association, the BGMA, the Bangladesh Textile Association. So it's in the textile industry, but they have put together a set of rules that they would like companies to consider when they're sourcing. So to become we always talk about the kind of compliant, socially compliant producers, but they were like, okay, we also have some requirements on becoming a socially compliant buyer. And they put those requirements together. And I find that a really interesting initiative, also obviously giving a voice to people on this side of the world that are doing most of the production. And so that's really something really good to look into, and I think gives a lot of very practical guidance on how companies can, and they're very reasonable. They don't want to scare away the clients, so they're very reasonable requirements that will not destroy business, but make a real effort on making business a little bit more fairer and having these fair purchasing practices that can create the impact.
Thank you so much. Do you think you could share maybe the link to this resource with us, or in a follow-up email, and then I could share it, because I think this is crucial. It's really crucial to understand, okay, how can companies enable their suppliers to be socially compliant? Because as you rightly mentioned, all these new rules and laws, CSDDD, CSRD, are asking a lot from the suppliers now. They need to change their practices, or they need to comply with new rules. But if they are not paid more, if they don't have more resources at hand to tackle those changes, it's putting them at risk, actually. So no, that's really, really good. Thank you so much. Now, I have seen in the chat that we have a few questions. So I will start with the first one from Fiona, and the question goes to Sate. So she's saying, thank you very much for the presentation. It was very informative and enlightful. I would have a question regarding the risk matrices assessment from Sate. There was a comment on that if FOB was 80%, the site should be looked at. Can you explain why is that?
All right.
Sate, should we share the slide again, or you can make it
it's
like
okay.
this?
I can explain. Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you, Fiona. That's a good question. I think my point here is when based on the supply chain risk, the contextual risk, right, the inherent risk, and then the audit performance based on the previous audit. So all these combined, it will become the site will have a risk level. It might be high, it might be medium, it might be very high. But after that, we further look into the business importance. We are trying to use that to further help us to prioritize. Meaning, for example, we might end up, as an example, maybe 20 sites that are considered as high risk. So based on these 20 sites, how do we further prioritize where we should start first? So with that, we look into the business important. And so if, for example, 5 of them are having a higher business leverage, they are more important, then we will prioritize them first. Because we believe that because of the business leverage that we have, if there are anything that are actually that we identify, we have more influence power, and we were able to also, have, I would say, more business leverage to help them to work on more preventative actions. So that's the point I'm trying to make. So it doesn't mean every site that contribute 80% of the FOB should look at. This is a secondary criteria. the main criteria, the first one is we have to look at the different risk level based on, what I have described, the inherent risk, also the managed risk. That has to come first. Yeah, I hope I answer your question.
Thank you so much, Fiona. If you need more information, you can write or unmute. Thank you so much, Sate.
Thank you.
Now we have a question from Shira, who asks about with the upcoming EU forced labor product regulations, is in your opinion, how would this affect the companies and SMEs in driving the compliance? So Ines maybe, or Deborah.
Deborah, do you want to say something on that?
Or Sate?
I talked a lot.
Go ahead, Ines. I think you can
Okay,
start.
I think that, yeah.
Hmm?
Oh, no, so I don't have a straightforward answer. So on one hand, obviously we welcome any initiative that puts companies more on alert to really understand where their products coming from and how they are produced. We also know that it can be relatively tricky, given that it's not always easy for companies to understand, and obviously particularly this law also relating, I think, to some of the challenges that we're having in China, and the situation that we're having in China, which unfortunately is just very intransparent. So we don't have a lot of information. We have some information, we have some NGO information, etc., but it's very difficult to do an assessment. Companies cannot go themselves and assess their supply chain and look deeper into those risks, etc. So that all makes it very, very, very tricky, I think, for companies to deal with that. What we would encourage is obviously for companies to just do their due diligence, do their very best to actually to try to get as much visibility into their supply chain as possible, to try to engage in open discussions with their suppliers and with their Chinese suppliers as well in particular, and try to understand to what degree are they linked to certain risks and how can they balance these very, so obviously companies here, well, I don't want to give any excuse to companies or something, but you're kind of trapped in between very different approaches. You have factories that might be asked to source from certain areas in China, factories that might be asked to take on certain workers that come from the Uyghur region, and they have to comply to that because it's a government requirement within their context. And on the other hand, you have those factories who probably are actually quite eager to follow the client's requirements and not engage in any practices that would be linked to forced labor. And so you as companies and buyers might actually also get trapped into that one. Hopefully these regulations will just lead towards us increasing communication, increasing or trying to increase what we call transparency, not necessarily traceability, but to be very honest, it remains to be seen how the EU is going to enforce this, if that's going to be similar to the US law. And what that exactly means and how far they're going to go in terms of really, does it have to be proven that it comes out, for example, out of Xinjiang and has been produced with child labor, or is the risk that it comes out of Xinjiang or the suspicion is going to be enough? I think a lot of questions around that. And to be very honest, I didn't have time enough to look at or to think of this very thoroughly, given that I think it's been 2 weeks that this has been confirmed. But yeah, it's definitely something that we're going to look at closely and try to guide companies on how to deal with that. But it's a tricky one.
Thank you so much, Ines. The next question from Ahmad is, how can NGOs address child labor issues outside of supply chains, such as in brick kilns, domestic work, and street markets?
I can take this question. I think, the tools and the mechanisms that we have in place to tackle child labor in supply chains, they also apply to child labor more broadly. So for instance, creating informal and formal child protection mechanisms in communities can also apply to cities. We can also promote a safe school environment outside supply chains. By creating child-friendly spaces, for example, we can also have a place where children can go, affected children can go and speak about their challenges when they are hired as domestic workers or working on the street. We can also, as an NGO, advocate for law enforcement by the government, also in these more informal sectors, and for the creation of law so that children are protected from child labor and violence in these particular sectors as well. So I would say, yeah, in a nutshell, I think we have already tools available that can also be applied in those other child labor cases that are not relating to supply chains. I think the
Thank you.
programs would probably be funded differently, because normally if we implement community interventions that relate to supply chains, then companies are contributing financially to the implementation of it. In the case of other child labor cases, it would probably more be funded by institutional donors or other sources of funding.
Thank you so much, Deborah. Now we have a question by Carol from 1023 Health. So she's asking, is the first step to the assessment is to check what products are at risks. So if our company does not work with obvious products like cacao, coffee, cotton, but maybe there are some products that are at risk, but that are not so obvious. And if they are a Swiss company with Swiss, European, or US suppliers, are we still at risk? How to explore that?
I mean, I can maybe talk to that. We had actually, we just recently worked with a range of Swiss companies where we had maybe similar questions to start with. So obviously the question is always, for one, when you say you're sourcing from Swiss, European, or US suppliers, the question is, are those your, what level of the supply chain are they? A lot of times we have agents that might, for one, have actually other regions where they're originally sourcing from. So it's important to understand, are these our kind of raw material suppliers? Is that where it's produced? Or do these suppliers in turn have a whole chain of other supply chains? And particularly the Swiss law is a little bit less stringent, but the European law will be even more stringent on, you really need to look at that whole chain. So not just on your direct business partners, but really beyond the business partners. So that obviously often opens then the kind of spectrum of potential risks significantly. And we know that obviously even European or US producers have some risk depending on your processes and your products. So for example, we have a heightened risk of child labor in the US in things like food production, but also other processes where we saw that the US seems to be very high risk. And that actually has led to the center working intensively in the US in the last 2 years, which before, to be very honest, we didn't even consider that we might have to go there. But the same companies that work with us in Asia have now asked us to basically, and many of them are American companies, and say, oh, we need to go back to the US and look at conditions there. And we obviously also know Eastern Europe as well as Southern Europe, with certain migration context in particular, we have increased risk. So it is important to look at your products, understand how they're produced, and look at your supplier, try to understand, are these the suppliers, are these the producers, or where is it coming from? Looking at some of your raw materials. We have a Swiss company which I can talk about, Dormakaba. I think they were in a previous call as well, but in a previous series. But they saw that they have small amounts of cobalt in their electronic electronic household systems that they have, and have identified that cobalt, despite the fact that it's small, a very, very high risk in terms of child labor, and have then started to engage in those cobalt supply chains in DRC. They're probably not the company from the get-go you would call as the highest risk company, and they're not a chocolate company, no agriculture, etc., but have identified this particular raw material as a high risk. So yes, so starting with listing products, looking into talking to organizations such as us or others who have a good sense of where potential risks are, and then drilling down. And then you possibly can exclude maybe 90% of your supply chain as very low risk, but you might have still some where you say, okay, that's where we want to put our efforts in and look a little closer.
Thank you so much, Ines. We have a question from Miriam. Could you please inform us about tools and documents that help with high-level risk assessment? Do you have tools that were developed by the center?
So we don't have any open source tools that you could just download, other than kind of information as you got now in terms of like how to do it. But there is a range of tools. I think both the Global Compact, I think maybe you can answer that question actually, Alice, because I think the Global Compact has a range of tools to give to companies to start with. OECD has a range of tools of companies to start with. Obviously, it can sometimes feel overwhelming to look into those tools and identify which one are the most suitable, etc. So, but it's definitely possible to do so. There are for child labor a couple of child labor indices and risk indicators. There, to be very honest, I'm just coming from a discussions with a group of people to look into how we can do that better, because they're not very, very reliable at the moment. But if, as in the absence of very strong indices, it is a way. So there is the Child Rights Risk Atlas to start with, and there is some resources from Save the Children to start with. So I think, to be honest, tools are probably not necessarily the number of tools are not the issue. The tricky thing is always to get started, drill down on what information is relevant. But yeah, maybe you want to say more to that.
No, so as a tool, real tool, what comes to my mind would be the CSR risk check, for example, that looks at the regions and the type of products or sectors. But otherwise, I don't think that there is also, as you said, I think there are guidelines that we can also share after. But I think the most important is to do your value chain analysis, to understand where your products are coming from, what kind of processes are in there, and then understand this, and with that in mind, go and see if the countries they are produced in, are there risks in those countries? Do these processes are also at risk of child labor? But I wouldn't have like a form or something that is a tool that you can just put your information in. Maybe Sate, you have a tool that you've been using.
I want to say something here. I think first of all, there is not like one tool for everything. I think oftentimes is a combination of multiple tools, number one. Secondly, is also for us, we do have some tools, but at the same time, we also use, I would say, trying to build an Excel with macro, and taking consideration of the different criteria. It's not, I would say, of course, I would like that to digitize it, right? But then also because of the dynamic of the changes of the business, so and so. And at this point, we are still, I would say, more flexible to use the Excel. But having said that, my main point is that I want to say that because yes, we can look into the country risk, we can look into the sector risk, we can look into the material risk, and all this information that are public available information. But apart from that, I think it's also important. The other missing piece is actually your suppliers. Who do you work with? Where are they? And then, the tier one and also down to the value chain, right? Who are the tier two? Who are the tier three? I think that is something that is not publicly available because it's actually specific to your supply chain, the product that you buy. So therefore, I think the important point from my point of view is actually you have to engage with your supplier. And then so you have to start looking into I would say, to map them. I think that's also go back to the question about the EU forced labor, right? Yes, I'm sure that it will have impact in all companies, but it's a matter of what I think we need to understand what type of impact in order to understand, meaning that we have to understand where are the risks, And so the first step I would really recommend is really just to engage with the suppliers the factories, and understanding who are the upstream, who are the players in the supply chain. And then that's the first point. I think, otherwise, we are just sort of only knowing the tier one, and according to the CSWD and the and also the EU forced labor ban, and also the US Weaker Forced Labor Prevention Act. That's not enough, right? It's no longer acceptable to say that, oh, we only know our tier one, right? So therefore, I highly recommend to start looking into your supply chain partner. Who are they? Having a conversation. And also there has been, I would say, a discussion, in different retailer brands, that are they going to do audits at the upstream? At this point, I think it's not like I would say, a definite approach. Some of them are more like, okay, let's just visit them to see how they are, at least to get some basic understanding first. And also at the end of the day, you're just imposing another audit. Does it really solve the problem? And other things I would like to add is that I think we need to constantly look into what sort of innovative tools out in the market, particular around how can we make use of the data to help us, right? And particular for our company, with the number of facility that we have, we need some tools to help us to analyze the risk, and data is a key thing. And so I'll just give an example. We are using a tool that to help us to screen the sanctioned entity. So we are able to upload all our supply factory name, address, the tier one upstream, and that it will able to show us which one is actually having a direct risk under the sanction, which one are indirect. And based on that, then we can, with knowing that, then you can decide on the next step, right? How do you engage? How do you plan for the next step, with all the direct and indirect supply that are flagged with sanction risk? So I don't think there is a silver bullet here at this point, but I think it's really important for each of the company. You need to think about what are the due diligence that you have in place, and are these due diligence, I would say, sufficient right now, or is there any gap, or is there anything that you can make it better? And how can you actually partner with different industry organization, and different, I would say, industry partner, to drive, I say, the improvement together. I think that's a very important step. It's really to show that you have a program in place, you have a due diligence in place, you are continuously improving it to make it better and to mitigate the risk in your supply chain. So that's what I want to say. Sorry for taking too long. Yeah.
That was wonderful. Thank you so much, Sate. I think you're really speaking from the experience, right? And I think this is exactly what we need. There is no silver bullet. I think that's a very to the point observation. And you need to know your supply chain, your suppliers. But we will speak in the next webinar about this stakeholder engagement. I think this is also sometimes what we hear companies saying, yeah, but I would like to engage, but I don't know really with who, because it's so down the tiers. And I think here there is also a lot to be said, which will be then in the next webinar. But Sate, you wanted to add something.
The last point actually I just want to add is, at the end of the day, it's also rely on, of us here, and also of course, your company, your colleagues. It's also the willingness and the commitment here. So we can talk all days about all these things, right? But it's also about, do we take it seriously and committed, and also, have, I would say, the willingness to push it further. I think that's also key, right? And at the end of the day, what are we doing in this webinar here is also to drive this forward, right? So I think in each of the company, we need this driving force. And so how can we bring other colleagues and other people and the supply along this journey? I think that's a very key important thing as well. Yeah.
Yeah, true words. Thank you so much, Sate. Really good.
Thank you.
I would like to thank really everyone who made this webinar so interesting. And thank you, Celine, also for the support of SECO, or the initiative, more to say, from SECO. I would like to thank as well Sandra, who is in the background, but actually organized this series together with us.